Frost on the fence posts. 4:30 in the morning, dark as the inside of a boot. Elias Marrow steps off his porch in a canvas coat gone soft with age, a 5-gallon bucket swinging from his fist. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. Somewhere above the black tree line, wings begin to stir, a dry, rattling sound like a deck of cards being shuffled in the sky. By the time he reaches the fence row, the sky is moving. Not clouds, birds. Hundreds of them dropping out of the dark like ash falling upward in reverse. He tips the bucket. Corn, table scraps, bruised apples cut in halves. It rains onto the frozen ground in a long, hissing arc. The crows come down all at once, a black tide folding over the field, and Elias Marrow just stands there in the middle of them, hat brim dripping with cold, saying nothing at all. Not one bird touches him. Not one flies at his face. They simply eat, and he simply watches. The way a man watches rain he has stopped minding. Behind the curtains of Nash Fork, a few porch lights blink on. Folks watch an old man do something they cannot explain, and something they have quietly decided not to ask him about. If you're new around this fence row, welcome. Hit that subscribe button before the sun comes up on this story, and drop a comment telling me what corner of the world you're watching from tonight. Some of you are drinking coffee at dawn just like Elias. Some of you are winding down after a long shift. Either way, I'm glad you're here for this one. Now, let's go back to where this all began. Nash Fork sits in the folds of McCreary County, Kentucky, a place where the hills close in so tight the sun doesn't clear the ridge until 9 some mornings. It's the kind of town where everybody's mailbox has a nickname and everybody's business gets discussed at the feed store before it gets discussed at home. Elias Marrow had farmed 40 acres there for going on 50 years, corn, squash, a stand of sorghum his wife Adeline used to boil down every October into syrup dark as coffee. Adeline had been gone 3 winters now. Elias still set 2 cups out some mornings, out of habit more than hope, before catching himself and pouring the second one down the sink. The farm was behind on its county taxes. Not far behind, but far enough. A letter had come in March, county seal pressed into the corner, informing Elias that if the back taxes weren't settled by the last Friday of September, the Marrow land would go up on the courthouse steps at public auction, sold to whoever bid highest, crows and cornfield and all. His granddaughter, Sable, 17 and sharp-tongued in the way only a girl who loves somebody fiercely can be, had moved in that spring to help him make the harvest. She did the books at the kitchen table by lamplight, chewing her pencil down to splinters some nights. "Grandpa," she said one evening, tapping the ledger, "we're $1,100 short of even touching this number, and you're out there every morning giving away good corn to birds that don't pay us a dime for it." Elias just poured more feed into the bucket by the door, the way he did every night before bed, same as he'd done every morning for 6 months running. "They're not free, Sable girl," he said. "Everything's got a price. Some things just don't hand you the bill up front." She didn't understand what that meant. Neither did anyone else in Nash Fork. Down at Krantz Feed and Seed, Odell Krantz had taken to calling it Marrow's Aviary whenever a customer mentioned the old man's name, and the customers always laughed because Odell had a way of saying it that made a crime out of kindness. "Man spending his grocery money on grackles," Odell would say, ringing up somebody's chicken scratch. "Whole county knows he's headed for the auction block come fall, and he's out there every sunrise, feeding the one bird nobody in Kentucky's ever wanted feeding." The story traveled fast through Nash Fork's church pews and porch swings, picking up details and losing kindness with every telling. Elias' neighbor, Cyrus Beadle, was gentler about it, but not by much. Cyrus farmed the plot bordering Marrow land, and he'd known Elias since they were boys throwing rocks at the same creek. "Elias," Cyrus said one evening over the fence, "I've watched you do a lot of things I didn't understand, but this crow business, I don't know if you're grieving Adeline or losing your mind, and I say that as your friend." Elias just tipped his hat and said, "Might be both, Cyrus, might be neither." He walked on toward the barn, leaving Cyrus standing there with more questions than he'd started with. What nobody in Nash Fork knew, not Cyrus, not Odell, not even Sable at first, was that Elias hadn't started feeding the crows out of grief or foolishness. He'd started 3 winters back. the same season Adeline passed. After reading a yellowed farming almanac article Adeline herself had dog-eared decades earlier. A piece about corvids, crows, ravens, their whole quarrelsome family, and how a flock, once it trusted a hand, would remember that hand for years. Would return to it. Would, in certain circumstances the almanac described only briefly, defend the ground that fed them. Adeline had circled one line in pencil. A fed crow is a farmer's second set of eyes, and some old-timers claim a second set of soldiers. 10. Elias had laughed at it once, sitting beside Adeline on the porch, both of them younger, both of them certain nothing bad would ever reach their 40 acres. He hadn't laughed at it since she died. Grief does strange things to a man's patience, and Elias found he had endless patience now for a task that asked nothing of him but consistency. Rise before light, walk to the fence row, empty the bucket, stand still. Over 3 years, the crows had gone from a wary dozen circling the tree line to a black congregation that blotted out the eastern sky each dawn. Count them yourself sometime. Sable had, one morning, out of boredom. She'd stopped at 1,000 and quit counting because more kept coming. He never told anyone why. Not because it was a secret exactly, but because saying it aloud made it sound exactly as foolish as the county already believed. I'm feeding crows because my dead wife's almanac said someday they'll fight off something. Was not a sentence a man says out loud in a feed store without losing what little dignity a tax auction hadn't already stripped from him. So Elias let Nash Fork believe what it wanted. He kept rising in the dark. He kept filling the bucket, even as the summer wore on and the tax deadline crept closer on the kitchen calendar. Red circle bleeding a little more urgent every week. Sable crossed off a day. By late July, the corn should have been shoulder-high and thick as a wall. Instead, a dry spell settled over McCreary County and refused to leave. Elias' sorghum stunted. His squash vines curled up brown at the edges like old paper left too near a stove. Cyrus Beetle's fields next door fared little better, and the two men stood at the fence one blistering evening surveying rows that should have promised a harvest and instead promised almost nothing. "Elias," Cyrus said quietly, no mockery left in his voice now, only tiredness. "Even if you sell every ear you've got, I don't see how you clear that tax bill by September." That night, for the first time since Adeline's funeral, Elias didn't go out to feed the crows. He sat instead at the kitchen table long after Sable had gone to bed, staring at the ledger with its red circle closing in, and he let himself, just for one evening, believe Cyrus was right, that he'd spent 3 years and a grocery budget he couldn't spare on a superstition scratched into the margin of a dead woman's almanac, and that come September, some stranger with deeper pockets would own the ground his wife was buried near. The bucket sat empty by the door. Outside in the dark, the crows waited on a fence rail that stayed bare till dawn. Sable found him there at 5 in the morning, still in yesterday's shirt, the bucket untouched. She didn't scold him. She filled it herself in silence and carried it out to the fence row alone, scattering the corn with hands that shook a little in the cold. The crows came down around her the way they'd come down around her grandfather for 3 years running, cautious, then trusting, settling close enough that she could hear the dry rasp of 1,000 wingbeats folding shut at once. When she came back inside, she didn't say a word. She just set the empty bucket by the door where it always sat, waiting for morning. That small, wordless act did something to Elias that Cyrus's doubt and Odell's mockery never managed. He rose the next morning before the alarm, filled the bucket himself, and walked back out to the fence row like nothing had ever paused. "Reckon I owe you an explanation someday, Sable girl," he said at breakfast, "but not today. Today I just owe those birds their corn." Sable didn't press him. She'd inherited her grandmother's patience along with her grandmother's sharp tongue, and some mornings patience was the harder inheritance to carry. August limped by, dry and mean. The tax deadline crept to 6 weeks, then 4. Elias sold what squash survived at the Saturday market for a fraction of what he needed, and Sable kept the ledger's red circle in the corner of her eye like a second heartbeat. Odell Krantz, ringing up her purchase of seed corn one Thursday, couldn't help himself. "Y'all still feeding them crows out there? Might want to start eating that corn yourselves, way things are looking for your granddaddy's place." Sable didn't answer him. She paid for her seed and walked out with her chin level, the way Elias had taught her. By early September, 3 weeks from the auction date stamped on the county letter, the dry spell finally broke, not with rain, but with something worse. A haze rolled over the ridge from the direction of the Cumberland, a low brown shimmer that folded across the sky like heat off a griddle, except it moved wrong, in waves, in a rhythm no weather front ever kept. Cyrus Beadle was the first to see it clearly from his porch, and he dropped his coffee cup on the boards without even noticing he'd let it go. It was locusts, a grasshopper swarm thick enough to dim the morning sun, the kind old-timers in McCreary County still told stories about from decades back, the kind nobody living had actually seen descend on their own fields until that morning. It came down the ridge like a curtain being drawn across the valley, and everywhere it touched, green disappeared. Cyrus's remaining corn, the Fitch family's tobacco, Odell Krantz's own garden plot behind the feed store, stripped to stalks within the hour. County extension trucks would later call it the worst outbreak in 30 years. Nash Fork just called it the day the sky turned brown at 9 in the morning. Elias Marrow was in the field when it hit, bucket already empty from that morning's feeding, and he watched the brown curtain roll toward his own remaining rows of sorghum and squash, with the particular calm of a man who has already lost enough in his life to recognize the shape of losing something else. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply looked up toward the tree line where 1,000 black shapes still sat finishing their breakfast, and for reasons he couldn't have explained even to Adeline, he lifted his arm and waved it once across the sky, the way he did each morning when the feeding was done. The crows rose, not scattering, rising together, a black wall lifting off the fence row all at once with a sound like a held breath finally let go. They didn't fly away from the locust swarm. They flew straight into it. Cyrus Beadle, still standing on his porch with a shattered coffee cup at his feet, watched 1,000 crows fold themselves into that brown, shimmering curtain and simply start eating. It wasn't neat. It wasn't quiet. The sky over the Marrow place turned into a churning, screeching, wing-beating riot, black and brown tangled together in a fight that had no referee and no rules. And underneath it, Elias' sorghum stood untouched while Cyrus's own stripped cornfield lay bare 30 yards away. Sable ran out onto the porch, hand over her mouth, watching her grandfather's 3 years of dawn buckets pay a bill nobody in Nash Fork had known was coming due. By noon, word had reached the courthouse steps themselves, where Wendell Fitch, the county assessor who'd stamped that auction letter back in March, drove out to see it with his own eyes, tobacco fields on either side of the road stripped to brown stubble, and one lone stretch of green sorghum standing at the Marrow place like a held-out hand. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to Elias in months stood at his fence line by afternoon, watching crows still working the last stragglers out of his squash vines, saying very little, because there wasn't a mocking word left in the county that fit what they were looking at. Odell Krantz drove out himself that evening, engine idling at the edge of the drive, and just sat there a long while looking at the only green field left in that end of McCreary County. He didn't get out of his truck. He didn't say a word to Elias. He just turned around, eventually, and drove back toward town, past a feed store with a stripped garden plot behind it, and a joke he'd told for 3 years that didn't have anywhere left to land. The Marrow harvest that came in that September wasn't large, but it was whole, and whole was worth more that year than any harvest McCreary County had seen in a decade. Elias sold his sorghum syrup, and what squash the crows had spared at triple the going rate to neighbors who'd lost everything and needed what little green the valley still had. It was enough, with 2 weeks to spare, to walk into the courthouse and settle the account before his name ever reached the auction steps. Cyrus Beadle showed up at the fence row a few mornings later, before light, holding a bucket of his own scratch corn he'd bought special from Odell's restocked shelves. He didn't say much, just stood beside Elias in the cold, the two of them scattering corn together while the crows came down out of a sky gone quiet and ordinary again. Sable watched from the porch, pouring 2 cups of coffee out of old habit, and this time she carried the second one out to the fence row instead of pouring it down the sink. Folks in Nash Fork still talk about that September, though nobody calls it Marrow's aviary anymore. They call it the year the crows paid their bill. Elias never did explain the almanac, or Adeline's penciled note, or the 3 years of dawns that came before the locusts. He figured the corn had already said everything that needed saying. Some debts, it turns out, aren't paid in dollars. They're paid one bucket, one morning, 1,000 small mouths at a time, until the one morning you finally need them to pay you back.